Recording in progress.
Chair, you're live.
Good afternoon. I will now call to order this meeting of the Napa County Board of Supervisors, Monday, June 12th at 1:30 p.m. Roll call, please.
Vice Chair Gallagher,
Here.
Supervisor Cottrell,
Here.
Supervisor Berryessa, Supervisor Gregory,
Here.
Chair Ramos.
Here. And in honor of this being our special budget hearing, I'm going to ask our Assistant CEO, Becky Craig, to lead us in the pledge.
Just read. To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We do not have any minutes for approval. We do not have any presentations or commendations. Mr. CEO, do we have any department head reports or announcements?
No, we do not.
Thank you. We do not have any consent items for special districts nor for the Board of Supervisors. At this time, we will take public comment. Public comment is on non-agendized matters. So if you are here to speak on a budgetary item, there will be public comment within the budget item for this. So this is for non-agendized matters within the jurisdiction of the Board of Supervisors. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes. I will now open public comment. Seeing none, I'll close public comment. We do not have any administrative items for special districts, nor do we have administrative items for the Board of Supervisors. We do not have any set matters or public hearings for special districts. The budget for presentations for special districts will be tomorrow at 9 a.m. Today, the one sole item, a big one before us today, is the County Executive Officer requests that the board open the fiscal year 23-24 recommended budget hearings, and 5 items are before us. Before I go ahead and open the public hearing on the budget, I just want to go ahead and acknowledge all of our budget staff. This is their first immersion into daylight after a while. It does take a tremendous amount of staff effort and diligence to be able to prepare a budget, and I'd want to start off with that and acknowledge that. And at this time, I will open the public hearing and turn it over to our Assistant CEO, Becky Craig.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to lead off. Thank you, Madam Chair. The items before you, as you stated, is the budget overview, the supplemental budget report, and then any comments that the board, that the public may wish to make, and any changes that the board wishes to make in the recommended budget. Staff will be going through its presentation this afternoon. At the end of that, during that time of the presentation, the board is free to ask any questions or for clarifying questions. At the end of the presentation, the chair can open it up for public comment on the proposed budget. But we will go through the presentation first. Just to follow the chair, I'd like to briefly introduce the team that's in front of you today. We have Becky Craig, the Assistant CEO, on your left, Daniel Sanchez, Management Analyst, John Buzelich, the Deputy CEO, Jasmine Elo, Management Analyst, Michael Parker, former Management Analyst, current Planning Manager, and Gina Penganabin, who's with the Auditor Controller's Office. So let me go ahead and get started. We have the PowerPoint presentation, and this will take some time, so please sit back and as we go through the details of what has been a very long and arduous process that has been led by Becky and her team. And as Chair Ramos said, my hat's off to the incredible amount of work that they put in. We're going to go through the economic outlook and accomplishments of the county. Then we're going to talk about the recommended budget book, go through personnel, operations, changes in general fund and net county costs, capital, transfers in and out, reserves, and then public comment and board discussion. So in terms of the economic outlook, a few things have changed since my letter to the budget went in. We have the Fed remains divided as to whether they want to increase the interest rate. They will be making an announcement on Wednesday. They're starting their meeting tomorrow. The expectation is they will probably pause the interest rate this month, and they seem about 50-50 divided about whether they're going to increase interest rates again in July. While inflation has dropped from its peak of 8.9% last year to 4.9% now and will decrease further to 3.2% later this year. It's still well above the 2% mark the Fed is looking for, and so there may be another quarter-point hike next month. Despite the monetary tightening, the unemployment rate has remained relatively steady at 3.7% and is expected to increase it to 4%. Inflation leaves consumer spending kind of sluggish with some mixed signals. People are starting to cut back on their major costs, but are still spending money on restaurants and travel. What does all this mean? The Fed Reserve has indicated their GDP forecast has been revised from 3.4 to 2.7%, so it's still not indicate a recession. The Congressional Budget Office, the State Department of Finance, and most business economists are still expecting a recession in the fourth quarter of 2023. It still remains at a point where we could be in a mild recovery or a mild recession. It kind of can go back and forth a little bit. There is broad consensus, however, that strong economic growth will return in 2025. The governor's proposed budget is looking at a $31.5 billion deficit. The May revise assumes slow economic growth for the first 3 quarters and stronger growth in the fourth quarter this year. They're kind of an outlier in that respect. The revise also includes an alternative forecast by the Department of Finance, which looks at a mild recession towards the end of this year, with economic recovery occurring in 2025. Since the governor's revise did not include the assumption of a recession, if there is a recession, these state numbers will have to be adjusted accordingly. Most importantly, the local economy continues to be resilient. Napa County's unemployment rate is at the mid-range for the Bay Area. Our GDP for the county has exceeded $10 billion and expected to continue to grow. Median housing prices have only declined by 3.5% since their peak in June 2022. The county's resiliency is reflected in our improving economic revenue outlook. Property tax went up 6.7% from the previous year. Transient occupancy taxes have rebounded. Sales tax remain limited because of inflation and reduced consumer demand, but is still expected to increase slightly. The bottom line is that overall, the local economy remains healthy and stable, despite concerns at the state and federal level. The budget reflects the situation by making strategic investments within the balanced budget and maintaining strong reserves. So the overall theme continues to be cautious uncertainty. In terms of the accomplishments, I'd like to talk about briefly. I won't go through all of them because there have been a lot. It's been a busy year, and the county has accomplished a great deal under the direction and leadership of the board. We have started our affordable accessory dwelling unit program and made loans available to people who want to build second units to increase the amount of housing we have locally. We have also expanded the workforce proximity housing loan program to help local residents and people who work here buy homes locally, as well as adopted a housing element. Go ahead and advance. Sorry. We've started construction on the new jail, and that's already well underway, as well as approved 2 fixed base operator agreements for the county airport, and improvements of the airport are in process. We are continuing to work on securing the sale of Skyline Wilderness Park, and we still anticipate that hopefully will be done by the end of this calendar year, early next year. And the board has begun the facilities master plan. This building is 50 to 60 years old, and the board has begun the ambitious process of starting to plan on how we build the next generation of county facilities. And then lastly, of course, there's more things going on, but we have opened a new fire station in Carneros, started a big data project where we're going to start pulling all the data from health and probation and homeless services and law enforcement, and helping to provide a better range and more efficient services for our clients and customers that we treat. And we are still working on the acquisition of the reentry facility so that we can repurpose that building and turn it into something that more meets the needs of today. And we are cautiously hopeful that that will be completed later this year. Many of those are continuing to be priorities into the next fiscal year, as well as developing a regional climate action plan, further realigning our fire services and responses, starting the general plan update, developing a comprehensive language access plan, and continue to make investments in our roads and county facilities. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we can do that with lots and lots of different pieces of gum. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Craig now to start the next section of the presentation. Thank you for your patience.
At this time, we'd like the Auditor Controller's Office to provide the next bit of information.
Good afternoon.
Your
Chair Ramos.
microphone.
Yes,
Can
thank
you move it a little bit closer to you?
To me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Ramos, members of the board. Gina Paganeben, Accounting Manager for the Auditor Controller's Office. You have been provided with the recommended budget book, which during today's presentation will be discussed in greater detail. There are several tabs delineating the various sections of the book. The first tab contains the letter from the County Executive Officer, highlighting the economic climate, budget process, significant increases in appropriations, as well as significant issues coming up over the next few years. The following 6 tabs in the book provide you the county's organizational chart, our strategic financial plan, and budget policies, as well as summarized schedules of personnel, capital projects, and financial for all funds. The next tab are the state schedules, which I will be discussing more about shortly. Following the state schedules are 7 sections in order of functional area of the county. These are summary schedules for each department and include mission statements, accomplishments, goals, and significant changes in appropriations. These are the sections that the team will be referring to today, with the special districts to be discussed at tomorrow's hearing. Then, last but not least, the glossary of terms completes the book. Now, if you could please join me in going back to the state schedules, which can be found on page 59. These schedules are mandated by the state as to the form and calculations in showing a balanced budget. Schedules 1 through 4 are for governmental type funds. We will start with Schedule 3, which starts on page 61. Schedule 3 provides our best estimate of how we will end the current fiscal year and what fund balance will be available in each fund to start the next fiscal year as of July 1st. Column 6 shows what we are estimating at the close of the year, June 30th, and this will carry forward to column 2 on Schedule 2, which is on page 60. On Schedule 2, then adds any new resources or revenues budgeted during the new fiscal year, which gives us our total financing sources. Column 5. Columns 6 and 7 provide our recommended appropriations and use of fund balance to get us to column 8, which is our total financing uses. The goal of this statement is to ensure our financial resources equal our financial uses, which is evidenced by columns 5 and 8. They are matching. This is a balanced budget. Schedule 1, which is back on page 59, is a more summarized view of Schedule 2. All the same numbers, just collapsing by major fund categories. Schedules 12 through 14, starting on page 64, work the same way, except these are for internal service funds and enterprise funds, which have a slightly different basis of accounting than the governmental fund types. And that is how these state schedules work. And on the next slide, this will show you a presentation today. We'll walk you through the various fund types. This is a summary of the fund types and the number of funds within each fund type. And I will turn it over.
Thank you, Gina. Gina is also going to help us when we continue through this presentation. As we get to each of the new fund types, she is going to explain how they are structured and how they are accounted for. So we appreciate her presence today. I wanted to introduce the board at this time to a concept called the parking lot. Any ideas that come up today during discussions, if the board is interested in those being discussed for future funding, to please indicate that we would put that item in the parking lot. Staff will all be listening, but any direct board direction would be appreciated. So we will be maintaining a list of any items for further funding and bring that back to the board at a future date. So our all funds, this is the most high level information. It totals $668 million recommended for fiscal year 2023-2024. This is a table where it's shown by fund type. The general fund is the largest single user of the county's funds, and that will be explained later. Operating special revenue funds, there are many of those, and they add up to the next category of funding. Then the other various fund types we will go into, except non-operating special revenue funds. Non-operating special revenue funds are holding funds for other operations. So all of their monies that are appropriated are being transferred to other funds. Similar with internal service funds, all of their appropriations are being paid by other departments' appropriations to account for their services as allocated. So in effect, the all funds budget is counting the non-operating special revenue funds and the internal service funds twice. So once you would remove that information, as well as transfers that are going in and out of the different fund types, primarily general fund to other funds, those in total about $235 million. So if all of that activity was removed, we would have a little over a $400 million annual budget, 430. But we do need the board to appropriate all of that activity in the non-operating special revenue funds, the internal service funds, and the transfers. So that is why you see a recommended budget of $668 million in order for it to operate at its maximum. This chart is to give a representation of that $668 million, how it is spent. And as you can see, the largest individual section is Health and Human Services. It is just below 1/3 of the whole budget. And that is reflective of the services that are provided to our community. You then also see public safety, law and justice. They total about 1/4 total. And the balance is in community resources and general administration, which we will go into further detail of each of these functional areas and their budgets. Okay, wrong button. Starting to go into more detail, the first highlight that I would like to discuss, which is across all funds, are the personnel changes. For this time last year, the adopted budget was 1,574 FTE. During the fiscal year, we have had a net increase of 11 FTE. And at this point in time, our total full-time equivalence is 1,585. We are proposing in this budget to add 44.75 FTE and to delete 6 vacant positions, 5 of which are in child support enforcement services. And that is a tradition that comes every year as positions vacate due to the reduction in available funding from the state. So our recommendation is a net of 38.75 increase of FTE with a position count then of 1,624. For more detail of the 44 FTE, which does include 2 limited term positions, I want to emphasize that not all 44 are recommended for funding this year or fully funded for this upcoming fiscal year. 18 of those positions are slated in corrections, and that is to give the department the authority to start recruitment this time next year in the 4th quarter to be able to have them hired, trained, and ready to go 6 months later when the new jail is slated to be operational. So at this time, we're asking for position authorization, but no funding related to those positions. But this time next year, we absolutely would be recommending funding. Health and Human Services Agency, there are 10 requested positions. 5 of those are for care court that, again, will not be operational the full year, but we are asking for that to be funded late next year, or excuse me, late during the fiscal year 23-24 fiscal year to also be onboarded and operational. And the balance of the Health and Human Services staffing is for administration and fiscal services. Next is another special revenue fund, and that is fire. We are asking for 4 positions, 2 of which are being transferred from the CAL FIRE agreement into the county as county employees, and then 2 positions that are new. One would be the fire administrator, and the other would be a second plans technician. The 3 next categories are all internal service funds. The information technology services, fleet, and property management are 7 FTE that will be accounted for in their internal service funds and then allocated out to their clients, which are all of the departments and the various funds. The 2 in property management are being requested for a 2-year term to work on special projects, and at which time would then be reevaluated whether that would need to be extended or not. And finally, the last 3 departments requesting staffing are general fund departments. The public works position would be in solid waste, and it would primarily be funded at an estimated 80% by solid waste user fees. The 2 positions in the planning department will be partially to wholly funded by permit and plans and all the other various services and revenues that are generated. And then finally, 2 positions in the sheriff's department. One would to be add a deputy to increase the detective bureau, and one to add additional staff support in records. That is the requested FTE out of the 60 to 70 total requested positions. These are the ones recommended by the CEO's office at this time. I'd like to take a pause periodically and see if there's any questions from the board before we move on.
Supervisor Cottrell?
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Craig. Actually, my question was, when do we get time to ask questions? So your timing was perfect. I just wanted to go over, because when you and I met earlier to go over some of these numbers, talking about this 44 new FTE, one of the points that you had made is when we're looking at how these are being funded, that very few are being actually funded from our general fund. So if you could, I think the number I wrote down was 3. And so if you could help us understand what that actual number is, and then just give some indication quickly about how the other positions will be funded.
Absolutely. So the corrections positions would be general fund funded and will be in the future, but at this time there is no funding recommended for those positions. Health and Human Services and Fire are both their own special revenue funds, so they will be accounted for in those funds and their revenue sources directly. Internal service funds such as ITS, fleet, and property management, they are allocated out to their customer base. We are going to go over that presentation in a few slides that show how much of that proportionately is general fund versus special revenue funds versus other funds. So some portion of those internal service fund positions will impact the general fund, but not 100%. And then finally, the public works, the planning, and the sheriff's requests are all general fund positions. However, the public works and the planning do have offsetting revenue sources for the majority of their activity. Yes.
Supervisor Pedroza?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Craig, thank you for this so far. You know, one of the metrics I try to look at is, in terms of employee wages and benefits, how that compares to overall expenditures and revenues. So we always track that. Last year, I think it was at 55%. Now it's creeping up to 61%. Can you just comment on that? And what I mean by that is we need to continue to invest in our employees, but I want to make sure that what we do is sustainable in terms of revenue growth and expenditure growth.
Right. So I believe the 61% reference is for all funds. In the general fund, we are still at 56%. So we are still maintaining a reasonable balance, and I will actually suggest that at some point during the next year when we bring the budget policies that we bring a policy for consideration of what our target is for personnel cost.
I really appreciate that. and I look forward to that policy discussion because it is something we need to be mindful of in terms of we want to be a lean and mean organization. But when you talk about growth, we're transitioning to a sustainable growth model, which means revenues are not going to continue to grow as much. So we have to be very diligent around our expenses. So I look forward to that policy discussion. Thank you.
Supervisor Gallagher.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Craig. I just thought it would be worth saying again your comments about the non-operating special revenue funds and the internal services funds, that those are transfers in and out. And so those are not additional funds that are available to the county to allocate or appropriate rather. So I think that's really important for the community to understand that the budget is actually 430 some odd million rather than the 668. So thank you for pointing that out. And if there's anything else to discuss that further, great. Otherwise, I just think it's important to emphasize.
That's it for questions.
At this time, I would like Gina to explain our first type of funding, which are enterprise funds, and then we will turn it over to staff to start the detailed information per fund.
So enterprise funds use the full method of accounting, much like a normal business does. They account for all direct and indirect costs to provide a service, and their main source of revenues are related to charging a fee to the public in exchange for that service. They are self-supporting and follow private sector accounting rules, such as recording annual depreciation on capital assets. Any surplus earned in enterprise funds are reinvested into the operations and capital improvements of that fund.
Good afternoon, board. Michael Parker, here with my management analyst hat on for you guys. So the county has five enterprise funds, right? The 5th Street Parking Garage, airport operations, animal shelter operations, Calistoga Fairgrounds, and a new fund that we're adding as of July 1, Lake Berryessa Concessions Funds. The total recommended appropriations for the coming fiscal year is just over $8.4 million. And I'm going to highlight 3 of the 5. So the airport division, which is found on page 185 of your recommended budget book, provides for the operation and maintenance of the Napa County Airport. This past year, the airport successfully negotiated 2 fixed-base operator long-term leases and development agreements. The $27 million development will occur over the next 3 years. The airport will continue to prioritize phase 1 construction of the terminal area redevelopment, which will facilitate FBO development. The second enterprise fund I'd like to highlight is the animal shelter, which is found on page 189 of your book. The county provides animal shelter services for the unincorporated area, as well as the cities of Napa and American Canyon, as well as the town of Yountville. All entities participate in the cost, and costs are shared by a percentage of the participants' population. The animal shelter has and will continue to prioritize emergency response and community engagement. Although the agreement with the cities and town expire in June of 2025, we've recently been informed that those parties are discussing releasing an RFP to explore alternative services, which could begin as early as July 2024. However, this would have no impact on the coming year budget. Lastly, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the new concessions fund, which is located on page 193 of your book. As of July 1st, the county will establish the Lake Berryessa Concessions Enterprise Fund. In March of 2020, the county entered into a management agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation for the administration, operations, and development of public recreation facilities at the lake. The board has approved concession agreements for the development of all 3 locations, and as of July 1st, concessions will be an independent fund within the Public Works Department. Recently, the county has selected 2 developers to develop several of the sites, and the county's concession manager will return to the board on June 27th to present an update on progress.
If Gina can give an overview now of internal service fund operations.
Yes. Internal service funds also works more like a business and track goods and services provided to other governmental departments and agencies on a cost reimbursement basis. Internal service funds offset their appropriations by charging for their service through a reasonable cost reimbursement methodology to the funds that use the service. Therefore, if their appropriations increase, that increase is offset by increased revenues and consequently increased appropriations within their customer department budgets. For example, information technology offsets its total budget by charging for various services based on either FTE, which is the number of full-time equivalent staff, or by computers serviced within the department. Property management, however, offset their appropriations by charging out by square footage. Each internal service fund has its own methodology for spreading common costs, as well as the ability to charge directly for specific projects incurred. The methodology and the calculations are audited and approved by the state annually, as the charges are included as indirect costs on state claims and grants. Because of this, internal service funds are not supposed to show a profit. They should end up balanced. However, if the calculation ends up bringing in more than needed, they are allowed to have a maximum of 60 days available fund balance with the overage to be reimbursed to the departments that paid for their services at the end of each fiscal year, and the books are closed.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Jasmine Elo, Management Analyst, and I'll go ahead and go into more detail for the internal service funds. So here we see that the county is made up of the following internal service funds, them being fleet, information technology services, property management, employee and retiree benefits, and liability insurance. This slide shows the 5 internal service funds broken down by each subdivision. Total appropriations are increasing by about $7.7 million for next fiscal year. This is due to an increase in staffing in order to maintain additional equipment, facilities, and systems, equity and cost of living adjustments, and the increase of liability insurance is due to the hard market. As a result, we are seeing an increase for fleet by 21%, information technology services increasing by 17%, property management by 9%, and liability insurance is increasing by 13%. This slide shows the internal service funds allocation to the departments that operate in each of these fund areas. The total allocation of internal service funds is about $47.8 million. Note that this does not include the employee and retiree benefits, since this allocation methodology is per employee and directly charged to the department. There are multiple departments that operate in the general fund. Of the total allocation, 50% are general fund departments. Health and Human Services make up 26%, and roads 7%, followed by all other funds make up 10% of the total internal service fund allocations. As mentioned, appropriations for the internal service funds are increasing due to a recommended increase in staffing. Below are the requests. We have 1 full-time equivalent for fleet, which is for 1 equipment mechanic related, and this will be for succession planning for the small division. We have 4 full-time equivalents for information technology services, 1 geographic information systems technician dedicated to support the assessor's office for assistance with ITS enterprise data, 3 FTE for information system specialists, 1 for ongoing work related to emergency operations center, 1 for an IT service desk to assist with the increased workload caused by higher levels of county staffing and an increase in the number of supported devices and remote work. The 3rd is for data support for land management. There are also 2 requests for limited term positions for property management. I'd also like to note that the broadband position is currently housed in ITS. This is to support regional and legislative efforts to provide universal resilient access. Using recently granted broadband funding for pre-project planning, the county will be working to commence the first set of broadband project partnering with internet service providers. These projects will look to other available funding opportunities for these last mile broadband projects.
The debt service fund gets smaller every year, and I am happy to report that we will be making the final appropriations for the 2014 certificates of participation, which will mature in June of 2024, and that is an annual $2 million payment, with 1/4 coming from Health and Human Services and 3/4 from the general fund. That will leave one outstanding debt, and that is the 2012 Clean Renewable Energy Bonds, which are about $250,000 payments a year, and that has 5 more years till expiration. And finally, the other types of funds, capital improvement fund. This is where many of our projects are done. As you can see, I've listed some of the highlights, facilities. We are currently working on the replacement jail. There are continued projects at South Campus. This is also where we account for our accessibility and security projects. This will be where big data is partially funded, as well as the acquisition of Skyline Wilderness Park, which the board did set a designation of funds in December for that acquisition, and those funds will be made available when the transaction occurs. And the expectation that if we are successful in buying out the lease on the reentry facility, that would be funded with capital improvement funds also. At this time, I'd like to pause and see if there are any questions on enterprise, internal service, debt, or capital funds.
Supervisor Gregory?
Yeah, I had a question about where big data was housed in the funds, and you answered that. Thank you. You mentioned Calistoga Fairgrounds. Michael did, it being an enterprise fund. What revenue? We all know the condition of the fairgrounds currently. What revenues are we getting that supports the fund at the moment?
So right now operations were closed in 2020. However, property management is continuing to maintain those grounds and facilities in a mostly closed environment. In terms of revenue, I would actually defer to, if he's here.
I will take a shot at that as their current management analyst. Primarily there's leases, short-term leases, parking leases, tower leases, one nonprofit leasing space. They does not provide all of the funding at this time to maintain the facility, and the general fund does provide subsidy. But since it was an enterprise fund, it hasn't been closed yet, but it is not an active enterprise fund at this time.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. My first one is on fleet, and that's page 177. And my question is, why are we adding to fund balance on fleet if it is an internal service fund? And if I heard correctly, and Gina said that ITS can have 60 days. Is that correct? 60 days of operating funds for ITS on internal service.
That's correct.
So why are we adding into fleet management on 177? There's a recommended 63,000.
At the time the internal service fees were calculated, and Michael can go into this more detail, we have to do estimates in the fall. So in the fall, we actually create the internal service fund budgets, and those estimates have a lot of variables, including salaries, benefit, cost increases, as well as the other internal service funds who impact it. So the assumptions are made in order to prepare that budget and to calculate those allocations out for all of the other funds, and it appears that we overestimated the actual expenses that would occur in fleet for next fiscal year. So then those monies will become available when we do the allocation, and we would either spread those monies back out to all the departments at the end of this fiscal year, or reduce our expected expenses next year to be able to use those funds if collected?
So the 60-day operating requirement is a recommendation from the state auditor's office, and there are some funds, such as fleet statewide, that are allowed to exceed that 60-day operating balance. And every year, or in years that fleet does exceed that, Fleet submits a memo to the Auditor Controller's Office with an explanation as to why they've exceeded that. It is largely due to their 3 to 5 year projection on replacement vehicles that departments pay into over the years, so that when a vehicle is at end of life, there's sufficient amount of funding to then replace those vehicles. So for the overage of the coming year's 60-day operating budget, Fleet will submit a memo like they've done in past years to the ACO as well as the State Auditor's Office, addressing the overage as well as providing a plan for what that overage will go to in the next coming year.
Okay. I would just say that to the extent, I guess this goes out to fleet management, my comment is looking at some of our functional areas, given that some of the largest increases for these functional areas are coming from internal service. I think we need to be very prudent about how much of each of the department and divisions monies we keep of cash on hand, because it is their largest expense that they have going forward. So that was my comment on fleet. I've made this comment before, and I'm going to say it for all of these. Fleet management, equipment replacement, vehicle replacement, property management. When we have a column that says use of fund balance, we also need to include what the available fund balance was on the beginning. We don't have consistency throughout the budget book on that. Some schedules do have it and some do not. I didn't find them present within the enterprise schedules. So if we could please include that when someone wants to be able to review, great that we include how much of the fund balance is being used. I will say I do think Public Works, in the narrative, I see it on page 178, that it says leaving a projected fund balance of 527, but I think being able to include it on a table is incredibly important just for usability. That was my same comment on vehicle replacement. Now to IT, I'm on page 87. So when we look at you'll notice ITS has the available fund balance chart, whereas the other enterprise accounts didn't. When we look at ITS on page 187, is the available fund balance that is budgeted at $3.59 million, is that representative of 60 days operating?
Hi. For the budgeted 6/30/2024, that amount that you see there is what you quoted, the 3.597,175. ITS is striving to have the available fund balance be the 60-day operating. At this time, I don't believe all divisions are at an operating 60-day.
So is that a high number? Is that a low number on ITS?
That would be it'd be a low number. That would be not making a full 60-day.
Okay. So I would just say same thing. I think we need to be very prudent because it is internal service and these are supposed to be chargebacks to the divisions. And again, it's such a large increase for each of the departments. I think we need to be very, very mindful on that 60-day operating. And I understand the need to be able to have that, and I do appreciate the breakdown of the fund balance that is listed on that page. But that is a large percentage increase over the prior year, adding an extra $1 million does seem, you know, that does seem like a very large increase. So that's my comments on those. Supervisor.
Chair
Cottrell.
Ramos, if
Yes.
I could, on page 165 of the budget is the summary of fund balances for all of Public Works funds. And I do recognize the interest in including that on the schedule of the individual funds, but it is captured here for fleet and property management along with their enterprise funds on page 165.
Oh, yes. I think it'd just be great to have consistency through all of the schedules because that's the one table that fluctuates throughout the book. Thank you. Supervisor Cottrell.
Thank you. Just a couple of items. First of all, I think Supervisor Gregory helped get to my question about the funding for Calistoga Fairgrounds and to see that the county has subsidized it through its general fund. And then my second question, also under Capital Improvement Fund, when we're talking about the big data project, that's the data management system. And can you just help me understand where that is housed and going forward?
Yes, so it will be actually in multiple funds. Health and Human Services will pay a portion of that, possibly some of the non-operating special revenue funds if those funds are technology-based. But definitely we expect that the general funds portion will be picked up in the Capital Improvement Fund. At this time, we do not have any monies programmed. It's out for RFP right now, and we don't know if it's going to cost 1 million, 3 million, hopefully somewhere in between those two numbers. And we will be bringing back that bid award for the board's consideration with the funding allocations at that time based on the users and the expected benefits.
Thank you.
Supervisor Pedrosa.
Thank you, Chair. So the Fifth Street Garage has my attention. Tell me about EV charging stations and what's in that budget, please.
In this fiscal year, we will complete the addition of charging stations, and so next year is a status quo operation of the Fifth Street Garage.
So how many charging stations are we adding this year?
Steve, I believe 12, but that may just be a number I am recalling. I will get that confirmed with the Public Works Director.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be interested in that because I don't think 12 is enough, but I'm not proposing any changes at this point in time. But maybe at a future agenda item in the parking lot, I would like to take a deeper dive on how we're spending the $563,000. I know it is shared, but I do think there's an opportunity to invest more in EV charging stations. This is an asset we control, partly, so I do think it'd be appropriate to invest more in our infrastructure. Becky, on the bonds, I don't remember because I wasn't here, but the 2012 Clean Renewable Energy Bonds, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Not a lot more.
Okay.
But I do have the debt issuance sitting in a folder in my desk.
Okay.
They are actually subsidized by state or federal funds. So it's about a 1% interest loan on the improvements that were made on various county facilities, primarily for solar panels. And they're on fire stations down at South Campus and across the campus.
Okay, great. No, I appreciate that. To me, I just always look at when it was issued, if there's an opportunity to pay it off sooner, so that way there's a savings. At 1%, we're not going to touch that at this point in time. I agree with you on that, but thank you for being mindful of that.
Those are all our questions.
Okay. Next, we will move to special revenue funds.
Okay, special revenue funds account for proceeds of specific sources that are legally restricted to an expenditure for a specific purpose. For example, our largest special revenue fund is the Health and Human Services Agency. We treat that as a special revenue fund because the majority of the resources are from federal and state grants and reimbursements. Therefore, we need to keep its activities segregated from all other funds. Revenues in these funds must stay for the purpose of these funds. I could also share the definition for non-operating. Yes? Yes. Okay, non-operating special revenue funds are very specific funds that must be held in a segregated fund to ensure the monies are spent for a very specific purpose, more specific than the operating fund in general. These funds build up through advances from the state or through collections of fees. The operating fund provides the service and after fulfilling the specific requirements can get reimbursed from the non-operating fund. This ensures no funds are commingled or used outside their restriction and allows for unused funds to earn interest and carry forward from year to year very cleanly on the records.
All right, good afternoon, Chair Ramos and members of the Board of Supervisors. John Buzlich, Deputy CEO, Administration. I'll be talking through the special revenue funds. And you can see on the slide, we've got a number of the most major operating special revenue funds listed here, including the Health and Human Services Agency, the library, Housing and Homeless Services, roads, affordable housing, fire, building and code enforcement, and child support services. Those are the operating special revenue funds. And then as we touched on previously, the non-operating special revenue funds have some very large number of funds, which then feed into operating fund and general fund departments. So we can see here the year-on-year comparison of appropriations. So fiscal year 22-23, we had just over $231 million. The recommendation for fiscal year 23-24 is $253.8 million, representing an increase of $22.4 million. And you can see across the number of special revenue funds the changes by each category. Starting with our first, the largest, Health and Human Services Agency. Some of the major or noteworthy adjustments on revenue for the current year and looking ahead and into the year ahead, coming forward. The COVID grants have either ended already or are in the process of winding down, also representing adjustments to enhanced reimbursement from some of the medical services. The state has initiated a major payment reform under the CalAIM program. And then the Mental Health Services Act funds are very challenging to spend, and the proposed recommended budget does include an increased use of those funds, approximating $7 million compared to the prior year. Notable changes on expenses. We have increased salary and benefit expenditures, largely related to the labor agreements. And we did touch on some of the position changes earlier. So there are 5 positions related to care court. Those are not being estimated to be filled until somewhere in the 3rd or 4th quarter of the fiscal year, so that the county and the department can begin recruitment efforts to fill the positions before the end of 2024. And then there are also 5 administrative positions, mostly related to accounting and communications. On a broad sense, with our providers, specifically the community medical providers, we have a number of contract cost increases that contribute to the expenditure increases for the agency. And then capital assets, there is a mobile office vehicle that had been approved for use in flexible work locations, equipment for an existing truck, and then the replacement of a kitchen oven. So total use of fund balance related to operations is $6.7 million. And then there's an additional $750,000 use of fund balance specific to the capital assets that are listed there. Next special revenue fund is our library. Some of the key revenue sources for library include the property tax, intergovernmental grants from state and federal sources, donations, and then charges for services. On the expenditure side, there are employees. There are 2 senior mental health workers. Those will be, I believe, housed at the library specifically, but are actually HHSA employees. In which the library will pay for those services to HHSA. And then 1 library marketing associate And I have a note with me regarding that is actually an add delete. So it's an existing position being converted to be the marketing associate and not an increase in staffing. Capital assets, there is a backup generator proposed for Calistoga, as well as an off-site materials locker. And then replacement, refurbishment, and sealing of the flooring for Calistoga's 100th year anniversary for 2024. Housing and homeless services, revenues are largely in terms of grants. These are intergovernmental revenues, again, from state and federal sources. I don't have the full roster, but I believe there's something around 17 different funding sources that help support homeless services in that area. And then along with the significant transfer in of general fund to support homeless efforts. The expenditures for the employees, you'll see in this department area are actually down from prior year, and that is attributable to 5 limited term positions related to the isolation and quarantine shelter having ended. So those limited term positions are removed. Roads operation and maintenance, major revenue sources are the state highway users tax and transfers in from the general fund. On the expenditure side, notable changes, we added 1 limited term engineer during the year for winter storm project management, or proposing for winter storm project management, and to purchase a snow and an ice sander. Use of fund balance, approximately $2 million. Affordable housing, notable revenue sources are charges for services. Those are actually charges from that unit to other departments, such as the farm worker housing under the Housing Authority. And then other financing sources are generally transfers in. And specifically in this area, there is a $4 million deployment of transient occupancy taxes that will be transferred into the affordable housing in the proposal for the fiscal year ahead. On the expenditure side of things, we have a significant allocation to affordable accessory dwelling units and the proximity workforce loan programs. As well as ongoing contributions to the Housing Authority Farm Worker Center. And I'll hand off to Daniel to cover fire.
Hi, I'm Daniel Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in the CEO's office. I'm going to briefly go over fire. So up at the top, revenues, property tax. As Supervisor Pedroza mentioned, our property tax are going up, and our revenues in general are going up, but at a much more modest rate. So property tax for fire has gone up, but not enough to keep up with expenses. On contract services and agreements, some of our agreements are with Calvet, with the City of St. Helena, and Town of Yountville, excuse me. With the Town of Yountville, not the City of St. Helena, sorry about that. It was not an intentional slip. And regarding transfers from general fund, the general fund does provide quite a bit of funding to the fire fund. This year we're recommending $5.5 million of a general fund transfer to the fire fund. On expenses, our main agreement there is the cooperative agreement with CAL FIRE. They provide fire suppression services for us, and that agreement will be going to you all for approval in a few weeks, but the expenses there are increasing a fair amount in part because their staffing changes at CAL FIRE, which we'll go over that when we approve the cooperative agreement. We are recommending for the Napa County Firewise Foundation $3.3 million that's budgeted to go to NCFF to implement the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. To date, not including the $3 million to date, the county has provided funding to NCFF at just over $4 million. 14. Sorry, I'm just full of these today. $14.5 million, not $4 million, excuse me. On employees, the fire fund is including 6 employees total. That includes the fire administrator position, which is new, and it's also including transferring the fire marshal responsibilities to the fire fund. Previously, that was in CAL FIRE. And equipment, this year we're including a replacement water tender in Station 21, Deer Park, and a replacement engine in Station 14, Capel. We're also recommending a use of fund balance of $6 million. And if you look on page 280, that will show the available fund balance. So the available fund balance as of last year was $9.1 million, and we're using $6 million, which will bring the available fund balance in the fire fund down to $3.3 million at the end of this, or that's what we're recommending to use, and that's what $6 million to use in the fund balance, which will leave it at $3 million. Which is quite a significant amount, considering if you look in the actual for 2020 when there was $11 million in that fund. Besides that, a significant source is the general fund contribution.
There is one more special revenue fund, and then we would like to pause for question and answer on all special revenue funds.
So our last special revenue fund is building inspection and code enforcement, which ensures buildings are constructed according to the approved plans and code requirements. Total appropriations for the coming year are budgeted at just over $6 million. A contributor to that is outside plan check agreements with third parties. And revenues are estimated at just over $5 million. Those revenues are due to inspection fees as well as plan review fees from applicants. This coming year, building is estimating to use $1 million of their available fund balance. And a significant adjustment for the coming fiscal year is 1 plans examiner and 1 code compliance officer is going to be transferring from PBS to the new fire division. Previously, those positions were housed in PBS but reimbursed by CAL FIRE. Overall, for the special revenue fund, building enforcement is strong for the coming fiscal year, but the division is looking to further strengthen the division by filling the enforcement manager position, which is currently vacant. This will enable the division to better develop staff and really polish the department's understanding of and enforcement of county code and state regulations.
Now we are available for questions on any or all special revenue funds.
Thank you. First up, Supervisor Cottrell.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for that presentation. Well, it's wonderful to have so many people here for our budget hearing today, and I want to get right to the point looking at funding for fire protection this year. And I appreciate what Mr. Sanchez has laid out in terms of the challenge in our available fund balance that we have spending that down, and that is not sustainable. We as a county thought we would potentially have Measure L funding, which we did not get, so it's not surprising that we're sitting in this challenging moment right now. So even though that fund balance is challenging, that doesn't alleviate the need for continued vigilance and action on our fire prevention work. So I am going to advocate that we double the amount currently allocated to the NCFF, so that we would go from a $3 million to a $6 million. And I don't think I need to go through all the reasons. I think first of all, what I do want to do is bookmark a conversation to have about durable funding overall. But that's not for today. But rather to just quickly talk about, the Firewise Foundation has been a very effective and efficient way to use county funds for fire prevention. We've been able to leverage through their work many volunteer hours and lots of expertise, and also the outreach that they're able to do to message the community and support the work of individual landowners who have been, I would say, motivated and frankly inspired to do the work that they need to do. So I think it's really a lot of bang for the buck. And so that's going to be my suggestion and what I'd like to advocate for. So I'd love to hear from staff about ways we could structure that funding wise. And also, I think I do just want to make the point that it's not just about the fire prevention. It's what we benefit when we can do this work and improve our standing with insurers potentially. And it also has a public health benefit and a climate benefit. And we know that fire resilience is a huge part of climate resilience. So with that, and just to walk through the numbers again, thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for pointing out that over the past 3 years, I had a number of $14.6 million that the county has funded. So that's an average of about $5 million. I understand last year the county had funded at a rate of $5.4 million. And so to me, to be able to go to the $6 million is a continuation and then an increase, which matches the overall county budget increase. So I find that to be very defensible. And I'm interested in what my fellow supervisors are interested in. Thank you.
Supervisor Gallagher.
Okay, well, you are starting us on fire. I had a bunch of other questions, but we'll go straight to fire. So I agree with much of what my colleague Supervisor Cottrell has to say. Fire prevention and fire protection are both really, really important. I think it is very important for the staff to outline for us and also to the public exactly what we are maybe kind of carve out fire a little bit more even and talk more about what we are spending on fire protection and fire prevention as a county, not just what we are granting to FireWise, but everything that we are doing in the various departments, because I think that will give everybody a clear sense of what the commitment has been and is going forward, that it isn't just the FireWise work that we're funding, it is all of the other work that gets done through the county departments. So that would be very, very helpful to go through. Another issue that I think is just kind of digging in, and maybe not here at this point, but looking at timing fiscal years versus calendar years, making sure that we're aligning with the FireWise calendar, looking at, our budget is a fiscal year. It starts in July. It ends June 30th of 2024. How is that aligning with the ask for the FireWise ask? For example, I believe there is about $3.9 million in the FireWise account right now that is to be expended by the end of September. And that is actually 3 years into the new fiscal year. So I'm maybe a little bit confused about what money is getting spent. So I think that would be really helpful as well. I think I'm just going to stop there for now because I'm sure others have plenty of comments.
Supervisor Gregory.
Well, I'll echo Supervisor Cottrell. It was very well said. I don't need to repeat it. For me, we've I think allocated $5.4 million in the last 2 years. So this year, when I saw $3 million in the budget, to me it was the wrong message. We should be doing more, not less. And so I was going to support getting back to 5.4, but going a little bit above that certainly sounds justified. The how, I think maybe that's something you'll answer here in a minute. If it's related to ERAF, maybe you can also talk about like its status and if it's safe this year. Second, the FEMA grants are still hanging out there. Talk to us about if we're successful in getting the grant, great thing, but it requires a fairly significant local match, and that might be a surprise if we're not prepared for it. So could you tell us about how we're preparing for it?
There's two pending FEMA grants. One is the BRIC grant, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant, The other one is HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant, and those two grants are quite significant ones. The BRIC grant alone is about just over $50 million, and HMGP is a bit lower, but still in the tens of millions of dollars as well. And we're still in the running for those. We have not been told no. We haven't been granted those funds, but we're very much in the running, and our applications are very competitive so far from everything we've heard. Should we be granted those funds, it's going to require quite a bit of work on behalf of the county, specifically on record keeping, but also managing the grants as well. The nuts and bolts of it, we will be getting there, but it's going to likely entail a lot of work from the new fire administrator. That the fire administrator that position is intended to do a lot of grant management work, and we'll likely also hire probably limited term positions as well to help manage all of that and work with our community partners to implement it. There's nothing related to those grants in this budget because we don't budget for money that we haven't received yet, but we're very much in the running for those, and we will, if and when we receive those funds, we will come to this board with staffing recommendations potentially and structure how we're going to go about with our community partners to implement those grants.
Give us a sense of the order of magnitude of the local match and where we might look to support that.
I recall the local match was pretty extensive. What was it? $15 million. Thank you. I recall it was $15 million for BRIC over 3 years. So that is about $5 million per year. Much of what we're putting in at the moment. HMGP requires another match as well. It's less than BRIC though. BRIC matching grant is the highest. HMGP is a little bit less, but I believe it's around. I could get the number back for you, but there is significant matches to that.
All right.
To both of those.
Well, we're turning 15 million into 50, and that's a good problem to have. So
Potentially, yes.
look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Supervisor Pedrosa.
The benefit of going last is all the good things have been said, and I concur with that. Ms. Craig, just tell me about the fire fund reserve. What's the balance in that?
We are projecting it to end next fiscal year at $3 million.
Wonderful. So I think having a reserve is good, and having a reserve to use when you need it is even better. So I'm not interested in this augmentation of it being a parking lot idea where we come back and talk about how. I'm interested in leaving today with a hard commitment that this board is making to fund Firewise to the tune of $6 million. So I just want to be very clear on my direction. That should be nothing new. The reason I think this is so critical is it's part of our tool belt, right? CAL FIRE's here, they do an incredible job of suppression, and they're also doing some incredible things, investing in Alert California and record investments, which is going to be more detection to help ID fires quicker. But really the North Star I think we're chasing here is how do we make our communities safer that our insurance companies also acknowledge, which means a lower cost of living for folks living in Napa. And there's some folks that don't even have insurance because they've been dropped. And if they have a mortgage, that's even more pressure. So to me, individually speaking, that's the North Star that we're chasing. And it's doing everything between the sun and the moon to try to accomplish that. What I know with Firewise, what they're doing is working. Both Supervisor Cottrell and I, our districts have been impacted unproportionately, unfortunately, by fires. So the reason this matters is $3 million, that it's real money. But when you talk about what we've dealt with and what people have dealt with, it doesn't even compare. So we do have a reserve. I'm completely comfortable taking that reserve to zero, acknowledging that next year when we have this conversation, it's going to be a tough conversation of how do we continue to fund the CWPP in a sustainable manner. But everyone is stepping up. I have seen people that typically don't like government let government into their properties to try to create fuel bricks. We're seeing collaboration in spades. So it is appropriate, but I do want to ask the community that we're in this together, right? So when we look ahead, how we try to create a sustainable funding stream, we're all going to have to get a little uncomfortable of how we do that. But this is not something that we're just going to do today. It's something that we have to continue to do because we're going to have to maintain these fire breaks. We're going to have to maintain some of these projects, and that's going to require a sustainable funding stream. So again, I hope that we come out today with a commitment, and I'm completely comfortable using that fire fund reserve versus our general fund. So those are just kind of my general questions or comments. More comments than questions. Thank you.
Ms. Craig, I have a couple of additional questions in relation to allocation of utilizing available fund balance versus a larger general fund commitment to fund the proposed additional allocation. Uh, my question is, if we were to have a bad fire season and we have extra expenses, would that be out of contingency? Would it be out of fund balance? How would we first pay for a disaster?
If it's a declared emergency, we would bring forward to the board a use of general reserves, which is allowed per the policy. If it is not a declared emergency, but there is a lot more activity, it would come out of fire reserves first, and then it would come to the general fund, whether contingency or other uses of funds.
And if I recall, the glass fire took a number of days to have declared as a federal emergency. And so we had to use fire fund reserves and then do an allocation.
That would be the process.
So I am incredibly uncomfortable in drawing down general fund to zero. Fire fund balance to zero. There needs to be sufficient operating expenses for the if that this entire room is worried about. We cannot be in a position where the general fund is needing to do an allocation in a non-declared emergency. And we have had a number of disasters that haven't reached that declared emergency, Berryessa Estates, Knoxville, and different areas. I am most definitely interested, Supervisor Gregory made the suggestion of when we look at closing the books, we know we have excess ERAF that comes our way, and that allocation of being perhaps a better use, but more specifically of what the tolerance is for increasing a general fund contribution. I will remind the board, we have had a large change in the cost of services for the accounts 52 and 53. I'm looking at page 280. When we look at our CAL FIRE services contract, given the new labor requirements that the state of California has negotiated with 2881, we're seeing a large increase there. We're going to see another increase next year. Right, Ms. Craig?
Yes, it will go up another approximate $1.5 million.
So we're having to scale up our funding of positions. So this year we are adding how many firefighters? Is it 8 or 11?
Yes.
8, 11, and then 3 battalions, Chief?
11, 5 are seasonal employees, 6 are permanent FTE.
So 11.3 positions that we are already having to add, and we are going to need to increase the amount of battalions that are into the field in 24, 25. I understand the great importance of being able to fund fire mitigation, but I want to hear from staff. How do you plan to do that and leave a fund balance? This projected fund balance for fire at $3 million, given where we were 3 years ago, seems incredibly risky with the level of fuels that we have. So I'm interested in knowing where else can you get this money from? Supervisor Cottrell.
Thank you, Chair. No, I think these have all been great questions. I just wanted to quickly, the point that has been made, that Mr. Sanchez made about the increased reporting requirements for BRIC and HMGP. I think one of the things I would also like to see us work closely with, and I want to give a shout out to the auditor team who's been, I know, working closely with Firewise to help them catch up on their reporting and documentation. And I just think that's so important as we move into these potential BRIC and HMGP grants, that we have to have our game be on point there, because those are tough reporting requirements, and having the fire admin piece on board is going to be important as well. And then the final piece, and then I also want to hear what staff's ideas there are that, you know, we talk a lot about the CWPP and that the board adopted that original 5-year plan. It's my understanding that the board has never actually adopted the expanded longer-term 10-year ongoing maintenance plan. And so what I would ask is that we get a chance to have that. I don't think anyone doesn't believe all that work is critical, but I think we should dial in on the details a little bit more so the board and staff are tracking the progress as well. So I think all of those things, and I think it's kind of a follow-on to Supervisor Gallagher's point about tracking where funds are being spent and over the time period too. So, but just to echo your question, Chair Ramos, about options.
Supervisor Pedrosa, and then I'll let staff chime in.
Thank you, Chair Ramos. And Ms. Craig, I hope that as we have this discussion, we talk about what that means from a commitment, whether it's a commitment now or a commitment in a phased approach. I'm interested in a commitment now. And I'll just look at our reserves. So we have close to $65.1 million in reserves under this current budget. 39 for general fund reserve, 26 for fiscal uncertainty, 14.8 for declared emergencies, including fire and winter storms. So I say that just to ground truth, how much we have in reserves. So if incidents happen, there's ways that we cover our services to make sure our residents don't suffer from the impacts of a declared emergency. So how you color it, not really interested, whether folks want to take it down to zero or not. I think that's viable, and I'm a fiscal conservative. But if there's other ways to do it, I think the point is providing the certainty so that way these projects can get procured and start planning on how long it takes to do those projects. Thank you.
Okay. The first question from Supervisor Gallagher was, where are other prevention services occurring in the county's operations? So in addition to, in the fire fund, in addition to what is allocated out to Firewise for its fuels mitigation, we also continue to fund our chipper program. So our chipper program is about $700,000 a year within the fire fund. Additionally, our roads crew does evacuation route projects, which directly benefit this project, as well as an allocation in relation to our recent winter fires that we have done a $700,000 agreement with Firewise to be able to do fuels reduction related to the storm debris. So there are other prevention programs occurring in addition to the direct allocation that is being discussed of $3 million. Next to Supervisor Gregory's questions, we will be closing the fiscal year, and we do expect excess ERAF for this most recent fiscal year, which will then be presented to the board for consideration. That would be the use of funding that would be recommended for parking lot items to bring back in the fall once the books are closed and the available monies are confirmed. In addition to excess ERAF would be any additional available fund balance, and we won't know that until the fiscal year is closed by the Auditor Controller's Office. And if we are wanting to fund it now, I would not recommend using available fund balance for all of the reasons that have been discussed, primarily for the unknowns that come up during the year where we need to amend the budget, whether it is an actual increased response or for additional equipment that may need to be replaced or purchased. So that is what the purpose of a special revenues fund balance is to use specifically for its operational needs. The alternative would be the general fund. And the general fund could do it either later, again, like I said, with additional available fund balance, including excess ERAF, or immediately we would need to increase the the estimated beginning available fund balance, and we would do that by drawing funds out of the accumulated capital outlay into the general fund's fund balance to be able to appropriate that. So based on the board's direction, I can either bring back a supplemental for if you want to fund it as effective July 1, I would bring back a supplemental budget amendment to the recommended budget and it would be a utilization of fund balance or increase the beginning available general fund balance or a combination thereof. And I think I answered the questions, but if I missed one, please let me know.
Supervisor Pedrosa, are you still lit up?
No, but a
Go
thought
ahead.
came to me as Ms. Craig was explaining this. So there is a possibility to do an adjustment once we close the books. And if all goes well, there might be some monies there. But the dilemma is, how do you provide certainty now? So is there a way to create a solution that has a backstop where we commit to it now, but if there's additional funding, that kind of gets swapped so we're not impacting other funds?
Utilizing the transfer from the accumulated capital outlay with the direction that when we do recognize the additional available fund balance, including excess ERAF, the first monies to be recognized would then be to replace the monies today.
Yeah, so we advance 3 million depending on when it's done with the proper documentation, as we've all said. But I don't think Firewise wants 6 million tomorrow, right? So if we advance some monies, we commit to the 6. But to your point, you backfill depending on how the books end and what adjustments we can make.
I think we need some additional clarification from the board when you use the word advance the money. We are working with Firewise right now to move over to a reporting structure the same as what we do with other grantees, where it's on a reimbursable basis. In the past, the county has advanced money to Firewise, which is how they built up the 5.9 in reserves. And if that is something, if the county is talking about advancing additional money rather than paying reimbursements, there's a difference between budgeting money and advancing it. That clarification direction would be
Poor choice of words on my part. So I'm not interested in advancing money. It was about the commitment of, we're good for the 6 million. What funding source we use for the other 3 million could be, the general fund, or the fire fund reserve. But if times are good, we use some of the additional funding once we close the books to backfill. Is kind of the concept. I just want to make sure, Ms. Craig, I was clear on that.
Supervisor Gregory?
ERAF normally gets deposited into the ACO anyway.
Yes, it comes into the general fund, and our current policy is to use it for one-time uses with the priority going into accumulated capital outlay. It has been used for prepayment of debt. It's been used for prepayment of pension. But yes, the majority of it and the default for it is accumulated capital outlay.
So my point is that makes a lot of sense to do that now, appropriate it, take out any question that we're going to do this in a few months. Because when we do get ERAF, it automatically gets back right where it started. So I can support that.
So to add to that, what I would ask my colleagues, if that is the plan to utilize the excess CREF and the close of the books, why don't we, instead of using fund balance of that recommended 6.1 million, why don't we bring in, it would be 9.1 million from ACO, from accumulated capital outlay, so that we leave the fund balance intact in the event of a non-declared emergency, and then to help us structure the increases that and the deficiency we'll have in the fund itself for the increases we're going to have in fire suppression contract services for the next year. How would staff feel about that?
I support the interest in wanting to maintain a healthy fund balance in the fire fund. So what I am hearing is in order to maintain that $9.1 million estimated at the end of this fiscal year, is to transfer the 5.5, but to transfer an additional 6, and then that way it will be able to fund the NCFF commitment.
Wouldn't it be an additional 9, because the recommended budget is to use fund balance of 6.1, and with the recommendation of the board right now to make an additional allocation to Firewise, wouldn't it be 9.1 of accumulated capital outlay so that we do not
Right.
touching fund balance?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Cottrell.
I'm still digesting that last idea. Where I was going to agree with my fellow supervisors is this idea that if it sounds like there's support for a current commitment, and then we use the parking lot idea to bring in that the accumulated capital outlay from excess ERAF or whatever else is available at that point. But we make the commitment now so that Firewise can plan based on that, and then go forward, as Supervisor Gregory said too, because those funds would be rolling over. Anything excess would be already rolling back into accumulated capital outlay.
So I heard it as a non-parking lot item, and my suggestion was make an allocation now that is accumulated capital outlay, and on the back end, the budgeting that makes good on the accumulated capital outlay with whatever monies come in at the close of the fiscal year, that gets dealt with as a closing of the book matter, not a parking lot item on allocation. What we're saying right now is fund it with accumulated capital outlay. Do not touch the fire fund, the fire fund balance. Leave that intact. Fund it right now with accumulated capital outlay, and staff will come back at the close of the books and we'll make the budgeting allocation changes then, but it being done now.
I think what I previously said needlessly complicated it. I think what
we got you. We got you.
But I still have a question of I think the initial proposal that was kind of on the table was just to work with the still drawing down the available fund balance to $3 million, and that works for me. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the logic. I mean, I see what you're saying of really stocking up in that available fund balance, but I want to understand a little bit more about the rationale to do that. And Supervisor Pedrosa, your facial expressions are saying a lot here too.
My understanding of the chair's recommendation is to go ahead and recognize that the fund is not sustainable and needs general fund support in order to be operable, and while maintaining a fund balance in fire for future unknowns. And the recommendation that she has put forth is to maintain that fund balance at $9 million and therefore provide coverage from the general fund for not only the operational deficit, but to maintain that fund reserves while doing everything that's recommended.
Supervisor Pedrosa.
The good news is we're committed to $6 million, right? So what I'm trying to understand, I can support either one. I just need to understand what the impacts are of going to the ACO for fully funding it. What gets, if there's anything that gets dropped off, I want to know what that is. That's what I don't know right now. So to me, the simple one is 3 from each. It's simple. You backfill later. If we're changing it, then I just need to know what the full analysis of that, which you can share today or whenever you're ready.
In the short term, it wouldn't delay any projects in accumulated capital outlay because there are funds in there waiting for future capital projects, primarily the future facilities that would be constructed and the ones that we're continuing to maintain. But the funding for those in the short term, i.e. the next 3 to 4 months until the books are closed, those are all fully available and would not be impacted. It would just be future year's activities that we would be able to refund in the next few months.
Okay.
What we're talking about is backfilling based on future anticipated revenue. We have not budgeted any projects based on future anticipated revenue because it's speculative. So it does not affect any current ACO allocations. The board would just have less money to allocate when ERAF funds and the books are closed later this year.
Got it. I can support that. Just on the fire fund, how often do we use it? On the fire fund reserve that we're talking about?
My understanding that it gets used almost annually for equipment, and then non-annually when there is an actual emergency.
So shouldn't the equipment be part of our fleet kind of management?
So some of it is, and then some of it is waiting to see what is actually needed. So continuing to evaluate and get every bit out of a piece of equipment. So it is, while it's scheduled over the next 1 to 5 years, we don't program all of it in this year unless we determine it's absolutely necessary.
And then you talked about incidents. So tell me, did we use it in 2017, 2020, 2019?
Yes.
Even though they were declared?
Once they were declared, then we would go to the general fund, but until they're declared in order to be able to fund. So even, for example, if the emergency is not in Napa County, but our firefighters are called, we have to amend our budget to be able to pay for them and then to receive reimbursement from the state.
Got it. Support the idea that's on the table. I will call for a deeper dive into the fire fund because to me, I came in with a different expectation of what that fire fund reserve was used for. If it's being used as bridging the gap between incidents, that's one thing that we need to keep an eye on. If it's being used for fleet purchases that should be covered in a contract or volunteers, I just want to know what that fund is used for so we have a clear understanding.
Sure.
Because our community is going to look at that fund that has a fund balance of $9 million, and in the future they're going to ask, is that what we should be using to fund the CWPP in year 7 or 8? So we just have to really manage expectations is what I would say.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Well, we've exhausted that. Can we talk about housing? Mostly, I just had a question. If we can, hold up. There are two I'm not finding the pages. There are two parts of, here we go. On page 77, we have Housing and Homeless Services General Fund 1000. And then on page 84, we begin Housing and Homeless Services Fund 2030. Can you please tell me differences and explain why we have both of them called the same thing?
This, and I can also defer to others, the staffing for our housing and homeless services programs are all in the general fund. And then each of those funds where the operations occur, whether it's Fund 2030 for homeless services, Fund 2030 for affordable housing, or Fund 5060 for housing authority, they all then reimburse the general fund for those staffing who are allocated and used for those various programming.
The only staffing that were in Fund 2030 were specific to the isolation and quarantine shelter, which have now ended.
Perfect. Thank you. Supervisor Gallagher.
Okay, I'll just jump around but stay on theme since Chair Ramos brought up housing. So looking at affordable housing, I'm just looking at the slides. I'm not digging into the book. I think just parking lot, wanted to talk about how we can talk a little bit more about our affordable housing efforts and how we might be able to add to our affordable housing efforts. And then I'm sorry, during your presentation, the revenues, other financing sources, was that new funding or funding that has come in over this year? I can't recall what that was. Under affordable housing revenues, there was charges for services and then the other financing sources.
The other financing sources category includes all transfers. So the notable one that I had highlighted was specifically $4 million in transient occupancy taxes that are being transferred in to the Affordable Housing Fund, proposed in the year ahead.
Okay. All right. And I think I just want to make sure we're looking at that again because we did have a, correction earlier in the year around the percentage going into affordable housing.
And
so
Supervisor Gallagher, I want to remind you, the board, that a comprehensive presentation discussion on all things affordable housing will be to the board in July.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's see. Also, for building inspection and code enforcement, I think this just brought up for me that it would be interesting to get a presentation on enforcement and code compliance. Also, I've been hearing a little bit about the code compliance policy manual. I think maybe that might need some updating. So if we could take a look at that and see if there are opportunities for that to be updated. And I think, oh, one other thing on the library, you mentioned the 2 senior mental health workers. I know there are mental health workers in the library now. I'm just trying to figure out if that's current or
That's
additional.
current. No,
Okay.
it's current. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great, thanks.
Any other specials? Supervisor Cottrell.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the comment about the code enforcement and compliance. And it was my understanding, I think there's a fee study underway. So maybe when we get the results of that, that's a good time to Supervisor Gallagher's point about getting a presentation on that as well.
Okay. That's it for us.
Okay. Would
After that brief intermission, you may continue.
No problem. The next section, we are going to be jumping into the general fund. So I wanted to make the opportunity to provide a break for the board if you would so choose, or we can continue on.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion. Sorry. I did forget. I am so sorry. Let's go ahead and 3:30. Come back at 3:30. We'll recess.
Recording stopped.
We're ready.
Recording in progress.
We're now back from recess, and I will turn it back over to Assistant CEO Ms. Becky Craig as we dive into the general fund.
Thank you, Chair and Supervisors. The general fund is where the county's discretionary funding is. All of the other funds that we have spoken about to date have certain restrictions or reservations depending on their purpose. The general fund is where all other departments and operations are accounted for. As you can see, the financing sources are projecting to increase from $240 million to $290 million, and our financing uses similarly, where both last year and this year we project a balanced budget. And the detail activity in financing uses, you can see operations is the majority of the activity. The budget policy to fund a contingency account for $5 million. And then you see increases in various reserves, and these are per policies. So we are recommending that out of the available resources that we increase the general reserve as well as the amount available for fiscal uncertainty. It will make a net increase in the tobacco settlement funds and actually a reduction for community investment, where those total adjustments total approximately $20 million. At this time, I will turn it over to Daniel Sanchez to dive into the revenues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The general fund revenues by source, the total amount is $250.3 million, of which the majority, 61% of that is in taxes. Of that, property tax is the largest revenue source. We're projecting at $122 million in property tax, which is an increase of 7% compared to the previous year's adopted budget. But beyond that, sales tax, we're projecting at $15.5 million, and transit occupancy tax at $14.2 million. Both of those are more volatile revenue sources, particularly transit occupancy tax, which is, moves heavily with the markets. And they're much smaller. Our property tax is more stable and much larger of a revenue source for us. And here are the general fund revenues. Up at the top are our taxes, of which, again, property tax is the majority of it, but we also have license and permits, intergovernmental revenues. Those include state and federal grants, for instance, for specific purposes. And charges for services are things including planning and engineering fees, for instance. Onward to expenditures. As you can see, salary and benefits within the general fund are the majority of the expenses, 56%. The general fund expenditures are $270.9 million. Salary and benefits are the highest amount, and this is, again, within the general fund, make up 56%. After that, services and supplies. These are contracts, supplies such as food at our correctional facility, for instance. Those would be other expenses within the services and supplies. Other funding sources, these are transfers out to other departments. For instance, the largest is a transfer to HHSA. After that, other transfers from the general fund are to roads and to fire.
Similar to all funds, we also wanted to show how the general fund's broken down, and the majority of it goes to public safety and law and justice, where combined that is approximately 1/2 of the general fund's commitment, with the balance going to community resources, general administration, and then the transfers out, which are the contributions to the other departments. Of significance this fiscal year is the changes in salaries and benefits. There are multiple ways to show the changes. So not only do we have last fiscal year's actual activity, we have this year's adopted budget. We did amend it during the year to reflect the changes that occurred with the labor agreements, the equity studies, and the 11 new positions. And that is at it's $133 million at the adopted budget for salaries and benefits, and it's currently at $147 million amended budget. We project spending of actual salaries and benefits of $143 million, and next year's recommended budget for all positions is $152 million. So the change year over year in adopted budget to recommended budget is almost $20 million, which is a 14.5% increase. I also want to explain a concept that is unique to the general fund, and that is called net county cost. Net county cost is trying to visualize what a department's needs are and where the discretionary monies go. And so it's on pages 57 and 58 in the recommended budget book. If it is a net county cost, it is the general fund. All other funds are available fund balances. And for an example of net county cost, if you want to look at the Public Works division of 12200, you can see that it is going to generate an estimated $7,773,000 in revenue, whether that's state monies, federal monies, charges for services, transfers, but it is also projecting $12.9 million in expense. And that delta, the difference between the revenues that are estimated to be generated and the requested funds to be expended, is $5.2 million. And that means that Public Works is projecting a net county cost of the discretionary available funds of $5 million. That is how the general fund is put together, is to understand where the various impacts are and the draw on discretionary monies. At this time, I will turn it over to Jasmine to discuss the general administration and finance departments.
Great, thank you. So here we will review the functional area of general administration and finance. This functional area includes the Board of Supervisors as well as those departments that interact with others in order to provide the day-to-day operations of the county. These departments include the Board of Supervisors, County Executive Office and its administrative divisions such as Human Resources, Information Technology Services, Housing and Homeless, as well as Central Services, non-departmental budgets, the Auditor Controller, the Treasurer Tax Collector, Assessor Recorder County Clerk, and the Office of County Counsel. Significant changes for these departments are listed below. The County Executive Office has reorganized risk management, has transferred the Office of Emergency Services to the Sheriff's Department, transferred the Concessions Manager to Public Works, deleted one secretary position to add one board staff assistant. Next, we have County Counsel. County Counsel has taken over the litigation for risk management, and they are seeing an increase in appropriations next fiscal year for legal services for e-discovery software used in ongoing litigation matters. This past fiscal year, they've provided legal support in the development of multiple land use ordinances. These ordinances include addressing small winery protection and use permit streamlining, utility scale solar projects, accessory dwelling units or ADUs, home hardening, hemp cultivation, and appeals to the Board of Supervisors. They've also successfully litigated child abuse and neglect cases to secure safe and stable homes for Napa County children. For the Assessor Recorder County Clerk, they have assessed valuation of $48.8 billion and recruited and trained over 70 vote center staff.
Thank you. Madam Chair, John Tudor, Napa County Assessor, Recorder, County Clerk. I wanted to just say welcome Ms. Cottrell and Ms. Gallagher to their first budget. This is my 45th. And I wanted to just review one thing that was said here that so everyone's clear. The number of, first of all, CEO Morrison mentioned a 6.75% increase. That was our last year's increase, 22-23 over 21-22. We don't know what our increase is yet, but we expect to let you know in early July when we close the assessment roll at the end of this month. Also, Assistant CEO Becky Craig mentioned a 7% increase. That's over last year's projected budget. And Treasurer Tax Collector Bob Minahan and I meet with Becky Craig and other members of the CEO staff to do a 5-year projection. I've always been very conservative in my 36 years as county assessor, and so I wanted to just break that down so that you understand that 7% is actual revenues and a projection of 4% increase in the actual assessment roll and property taxes. And I hope we'll make that. As you can see, our budget, our assessed value total keeps growing. We're at $48.8 billion. The larger the total is, the harder it is to get a higher percent increase. So we don't know yet, but I'm hoping we'll fall easily within that range. If I can surprise you with more than 4%, I'd be happy to do so. I don't think we'll be substantially less than that. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Turn it back to Ms. Zila.
We'll actually go ahead and transition over to law and justice now. Thanks.
Well, I'll briefly go over the law and justice departments, of which there are 4 that I'll briefly mention here. The district attorney, some of the changes there are salary and benefit increases have been substantial in a lot of our departments, particularly the district attorney. They've also been heavily impacted by recent equity pay increases because those are when the position in question is below what the market rate for that position. To probation, one of the largest priorities for our department head is use of force policies and reviewing a lot of those policies. So the department has contracted with a firm to help them review their policies around use of force. That the purpose of that is to mitigate risk to the county, to ensure that all the probation officers who are armed are able to use force correctly, and there's minimizing risk to the county. On the public defender's office, we are recommending to add a delete within that department to delete a public defender level 3 and add a public defender level 4. That's the only change within the public defender's office. And on conflict public defender, we're continuing to see increases in that. The contracts have just continued to go up for various cases and increased cases. We're a small community, so oftentimes there are conflicts of interest where the public defender can't represent a client. Onward to public safety. For the sheriff, some of the changes are the sheriff we're planning to assume the Office of Emergency Services. In addition, what Becky mentioned a few slides ago were 2 positions in the Sheriff's Department that are being recommended to be added. One is a Deputy Sheriff under investigations, and the other one is a Sheriff Records Tech. To corrections, the Corrections Department, as again we mentioned a little bit before, the 18 new positions that we're providing authorization to begin the recruitment process. But there's not funding attached to that yet. Besides that, they also have been impacted by salary and benefit increases and equity pay increases as well.
At this time, Community Resources, we will turn it over to Michael to discuss. It is status quo in Public Works, Agricultural Commissioner, and UC Cooperative Extension budgets, and Michael will discuss the changes in Planning, Building, and Environmental Services.
Thank you. Planning, Building, and Environmental Services begins on page 207 of your recommended budget. This department consists of planning, engineering, and conservation, environmental health, local enforcement agency, natural resources, parks, as well as building inspection and code enforcement, which was previously discussed earlier this afternoon. The recommended total appropriations for the department is just over $22.8 million, with a which reflects a 12% increase over fiscal year 22-23's adopted budget, and the net county costs for the coming year is $7.7 million. Over the course of the coming fiscal year, PBS's goals include initiation of the general plan update, implementing online permitting and digital plan review, completing workshops to, completing work plans to support the GSP implementation, as well as continued support of the Climate Action Committee, as well as the Technical Advisory Group, as well as development of a regional climate action plan. Significant changes for the coming year include the merger of the planning subdivision with engineering and conservation, as well as the addition of 2 FTEs for planning, specifically an accounting assistant, as well as a system support analyst. And for parks, an add-delete, converting a principal planner to a supervising planner, being the principal planner series is being phased out. And apart from that, if you have any questions on the general fund divisions or departments, we're happy to field any questions.
Okay. I do have a few. I'm first working off the general fund slide, which is slide 36. And so I just wanted to point out, yes, we have a balanced budget, but we are using fund balance to balance our budget. So that's 21 million. We are spending 21 million more than what we're bringing in. Or now I should say 24 million more, because we just added 3 million to your cost. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is how the county has done its general fund, because once it's set aside all of the necessary reserves per policies, the remainder of it is available for operations.
Okay. But I just think, you know, when we look at policies, when we look at our thresholds of cost of employees, when we look at the services that we're funding, we cannot continue to spend $24 million more a year than what we're bringing in. So I want to establish that as a baseline. I'm appreciative of this budget going forward. I understand that much of the general fund impacts are in fact labor impacts that we have had and that we rolled over on zero for a couple of years. I get that, but this in and of itself is not sustainable. Next, a question on contingency. So our fiscal policy on contingency, we fund at a $5 million level every single year. So we restart every single year at $5 million. What happens to the amount we don't use from the prior year?
That is then rolled into available beginning fund balance. We do not have any remaining this year.
Of contingency?
Correct. We have brought forward to the board.
I see 155 left from last year on the statement of revenues and expenses. This is from the auditor controller's budgeting. So
we may
was
have
that rolled over into fund balance, and that's
Yes.
where it lives?
It was rolled over to in part of the 7.8 million. Yes. Or into the 7.8 million. That would have been beginning available this year if it was remaining from last year.
It wouldn't be in the beginning fund balance for this year?
Yes.
So it's in the 41, not in the 7.
So not looking at what you have in front of you, the
I'm looking at
150.
this slide. this slide.
But I
that
mean, the
we're-
115,000, is it this fiscal year or last fiscal year?
yeah, it's for this fiscal year.
So this fiscal year, that would be in the estimated beginning available.
Okay. I think it would be, you know, one of the things we are very fortunate to have so many, I'm going to use the word contingency loosely, but we have so many places in which we are being fiscally prudent, whether it's accumulated capital outlay, contingencies, general reserves, and then fund balances within. I think it would be very helpful to know what we are drawing down on and where that amount of fund balance is coming from. I think going forward. So those are my general questions. My next one relates to, you know what, I'm going to let, while I find my spot, I'm going to let Supervisor Gallagher go until I find this question.
Thank you. Just to piggyback on Chair Ramos, I'm just thinking maybe parking lot is to relook at the reserve policies. And then the other parking lot issue would be for the public defender, looking at the addition of an attorney per the grand jury recommendation. So if we can put that out as a future discussion.
Is there any?
That was my question, and I'm going to go ahead and complete my thought on that. I do see that what the recommended that you had was an add delete, and so the add delete was adding public defender 3-4 and deleting a 1-2-3. That was what I saw on the beginning schedules. In the personnel schedules.
Yeah, it is to delete a 1, 2, 3, and then it would be to add a 4.
Yeah, so on page 46, on page 46, Schedule D, about the 7th or 8th line down is for my colleagues, is the delete and the add. And so based upon the recommendation that has been made to be able to have out of custody public defender services available, what I would like to suggest as the parking lot item, I don't necessarily believe that I don't have enough information. Not that I don't believe. I don't have enough information to know whether that is sufficiently as a full-time position within the public defender's office. But I do want to acknowledge we have added positions within Health and Human Services for Care Court, and we know that this is going to be a tremendous lift for the county. So my recommendation as a parking lot item is let's not delete that attorney 1-2, because creating a new position is harder than just not deleting it right here. So let's go ahead, and my recommendation to my colleagues would be let's keep the 1-2 attorney 1-2 position that's recommended for deletion. On a parking lot item, let's figure out the funding mechanisms and the job description that's going to be needed. I certainly am envisioning that not only is this for out of custody misdemeanor availability, but also for care court specifically, and how we can utilize the public defender in being able to prepare ourselves.
So the item on care court, we staff do plan on coming back to the board within several months on on all things care court, and which department or which organization is going to be representing the clients that would be in care court. And there are many talks in many other counties that it would either be a legal aid society, which I don't know or don't believe we have a lot of that here, or it would be public defender's offices. So at that time, we do plan on coming to the board with that. We did create a non-operating special revenue fund, a small one, for care court. So the state is providing us $250,000 in funding for care court, but that's just for planning purposes.
Sure.
But the counties can choose to use it for for planning purposes, including staffing. Regarding the public defender position, the position at the moment is actually a 3. The live position that we're suggesting to do the add delete.
Correct. But I'm saying instead of just don't delete the 1-2, the 1-2 position.
Right. The recommendation is to maintain the authorization and to return with funding in the parking lot.
Yes, thank you. Supervisor Cottrell.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was also interested in hearing a little bit more about this issue within the public defender. So I like this action item idea of not deleting but maintaining that position and then having a discussion later on about out of custody misdemeanor representation. And then my second question was about the Regional Climate Action Plan, and I think we've talked about it at a previous board meeting, but that we don't have the funds currently allocated within this budget for that work, and so adding that to the parking lot list, if it's not already there, I'd like to do that as well.
Supervisor Gregory.
Thank you. A couple small ones. Something caught my eye is that the general fund's contributing to the tobacco settlement fund, and I always thought that the sole revenue for that was the settlement itself.
It is, and it is a division of the general fund. So it is recognizing that the revenues coming in for that are going to exceed those that are being recommended because the county also supplemented it, but with $1 million. So this is just setting aside the excess revenues to make them available in future years.
Got it. Thank you. And I don't know that I see it anywhere in here. You referenced it. Are we at policy level with the two?
It's coming up on a couple slides, but yes.
Oh, it
we are.
is. Okay,
Yep.
I'll hold it. Thank you.
Huh? I didn't get that.
I was asking if we were at policy level on our reserves.
Okay, I missed the reserves part. I was like, what? Thank you. On tobacco settlement, which is on page 99, I did have one comment, and that is, yes, we did make an allocation of an additional bump up of 1 year to be able to have multi-year funding. Could you please include in the narrative what those years are, so that we know? I think we're in year 2, right? I've already lost track, so it would be helpful if the narrative includes that.
Correct, we are.
Thank you. Supervisor Pedrosa.
Thank you, Sharon. That parking lot's going to be expensive. But I do have a question, just a clarifying question for Supervisor Cottrell. When she talked about reserve, just more context of what exactly you're meaning by putting it up there, whether it's a revision or whatnot. It would be great if you could elaborate on that, please. What really concerned me, Ms. Craig, on the general fund, and I think Chair Ramos illustrated $20 million. And when you look at it, whether it was, I just didn't see it, but I had to go back and look at expenditures for last year because it wasn't on the presentation. Our expenditures increased 7%. Our revenue increased 3%. If anyone's household expenses were that way, they'd be in trouble. So help me understand why we're not in trouble and what's our plan to reverse that, because if we look at this trend, and it's been like this before, right, and I'm not going to attribute it to conservative budgeting, but these are concerning indicators.
Correct. And yes, this is not an ongoing sustainable process. It is recognition that we are having minimal growth in our revenues due to external factors with the state, and that will rebound in future years. And so therefore, this is the recommendation to use those available resources at this time to weather that, to then get back to the ability to have revenues equaling expenditures. And I believe you mentioned Supervisor Cottrell. It was Supervisor Gallagher who asked to bring back the reserve policy, and I also would like any direction available there for discussion.
If I could just continue before we get to the clarification. So that still is concerning when our core expenses are growing and they're fixed expenses, right? When you talk about wages and benefits. So, property taxes, Mr. Tudor quickly opined on it, but we are seeing the bump of some transactions happening in our community, but we also hear some voices of, slow growth policies. When you couple slow growth policies with this type of financial modeling, it is concerning. So again, we're not going to solve it today, but.
Right. So the other two, besides property tax, which we do not estimate any significant growth in its continued increase or any increases in its growth, sales tax and transient occupancy tax, we both projected at nearly flat this coming year based on the economy. And over a longer term, we do expect there to be annual growth in those. So we do see the ability for additional revenue increases in future years that we are not estimating today on a conservative basis.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great. I think just for clarification, wherever we have policies that dictate what is in a particular reserve, whether it's reserve, general reserve, fiscal uncertainty, wherever those lie, if we can just revisit what those policies are so that we can see how much what are the policies dictating in terms of how much we have to have on hand, and maybe comparing that to what we have needed over the years and what we feel like we'll need going forward, just to make sure that we're in line with reality.
Okay. Proceed.
Now, the next few slides to wrap up our presentation today are to recognize on pages, which I had a second ago, pages 51 and 52 are the Schedule F, which is where we be able to bring into focus, similar to our personnel schedules on schedules A, B, C, and D, schedules F, G, and H identify what is there for capital outlay. And this is the creation of capital assets, and these are budgeted in the various funds. But it's just to be able to recognize that we are doing replacement and additions of equipment for the continuance of our operations. In particular, on Schedule D, you can see that we have 150 million plus in capital projects still in process to complete, and we are asking those monies to be rolled over into the next fiscal year and to be appropriated. So equipment of $7.7 million is being requested for replacement or addition, and over $150 million in capital projects. Also, the last type of activity that occurs is transfers in and out, similar to the discussion of internal service funds being accounted for in both the internal service fund itself and also in an operating fund. Transfers also are reflected in two funds, being transferred out of a fund as well as transferred into a fund. Those total a little over 100 million in total transfers between funds. Of significance, I wanted to highlight the general fund and its transfers next year for community investment with regards to parks and arts, and the interfunds to Health and Human Services of $22 million, housing and homeless programming of $3.8 million, roads fund a little over $4 million. This complements the tax revenues that come in to do the continued repairs and maintenance of our road program. At this point, it was a recommended transfer of $5.5 million to fire, and the $1.3 million for debt service payments, and another $1.2 to groundwater. I also wanted to just flag, it's not significant in the whole dollars of the general fund, but there is $80,000 programmed based on a conversation a few months ago when the Small Business Development Center was here and wanting to partner with them to do accelerator grants for small businesses. And so that is also programmed in this budget. Here are the balances of the general fund's estimated ending fund balance. We project $116,700,000 in estimated ending fund balance for this fiscal year. Per policies, the general reserves is going to have $39.1 million fully funded. The fiscal uncertainty is two numbers down of $26.2 million per policy, that it will always also be fully funded. The reserves for loans and advances, those are to LBRID and NBRID, as we discussed at the previous board meeting. And the remaining board assignments, the FEMA reimbursements of 14.8, those are reimbursements we have received from FEMA, but we are still within the audit period, and those will not be released until that audit period expires. So those will be sitting reserved for a few more years. The board has also set aside $18 million to pre-fund its pension obligations of retirees, and there's $9.8 million sitting in the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, and various other department assignments of 4.2, so total assignments of 73 million, leaving the beginning available fund balance of 41.4 million. And to reiterate, we do recommend full funding of the reserves in the general fund, the assignment for fiscal uncertainty in both the general fund and Health and Human Services Agency fund, as well as the commitment of $5 million in contingency. At this time, we did provide one supplemental adjustment that was a replacement for various schedules in the book. None of those changes had fiscal impacts, but they were cleanup of some typos that we did not catch before we printed. I do want to, again, thank all of the department heads who are here today and their staffs in providing their analysis and support in their recommendations, to the Auditor Controller's Office in presentations of the state schedules as well as the various pieces of data, and being here today for the presentation. Human Resources Department for reviewing every one of the personnel requests that are before you today. ITS for their continued support of the software and us being able to prepare a budget book for you, as well as all of the staff in the County Executive's Office. And we are open to any more questions from the board, open for public comment, any further discussion, and then continuing this hearing to June 27th for final action.
Are there any other questions, comments by the board? Okay. We will be losing one of our colleagues at 5. For another time commitment. So what I will say before I open public comment, if I could have a show of hands of how many people intend to make public comment. Okay, excellent. So at this time, I will open public comment. I would ask that you come to the podium. You have 3 minutes to address the board on this 23-24 budget.
Chair?
Yes.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Will we have an opportunity to review the issues that are on that parking lot list?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So we'll do that after public comment.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Staff will give us a rundown of all of the parking lot issues. So if you would, please proceed to the podium, and you're welcome to introduce yourself in 3 minutes.
Thank you. Terry Gilbert, resident since 2014. I didn't lose my house in 2017, but I had to flee the fire. Had it on 3 sides of the house. Didn't know if I had a house for a week, and it was 3 months before I could get back in due to smoke damage. And I feel like after hearing the comments by the supervisors today that I'm actually preaching to the choir. But I wanted to emphasize one issue that was, I think, clearly understood, but that's the insurance issue. Just to give you an example, my son, who lives in Sausalito, called me 3 weeks ago and said that he was losing his insurance because Farmers was leaving the state. And he said that his insurance broker was able to round him up some coverage after looking around for 10 times what he had paid the year before. I have State Farm insurance and a State Farm agent, and who's been renewing my policy. And so I suggested maybe I could introduce him to my agent, which I did. They met, and they agreed to give him insurance. And he was going to go in and sign the papers the next day. They said, you need to come in today and sign the papers. And that was the day that State Farm announced that they're not going to write insurance in California anymore because of fire danger and whatever else. And so this is a pretty critical issue, and I know from I just know from other sources that the way that the insurance companies are looking at things is a lot of this Firewise stuff, not just it's the house, it's the neighborhood, and it's the government that's surrounding it. These are things that they take into consideration. And so the one thing that I really liked what I heard from the supervisors. The one thing that I'm not clear about is I think we have some bad optics out there because of an article that appeared in the paper, which said that Firewise requested, I think, 10.9 million, and we were giving them 3 million. Now, I've heard that, you know, that may not really be the case because of reserves from here and there. And so, but I think that from an optics point of view, that it's important that the community and the insurance industry knows that Firewise is getting whatever they need. And I don't know if there's a reporter in here today or not, but I just think that it's important that that message get out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please. 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Chris Warner. I'm here representing the St. Helena Fire Safe Council, but also, full disclosure, I'm a member of the board of Napa Firewise. And I, too, was coming here to basically urge you to fund the full amount of the request for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan for this year, $10.9 million. I do reference your discussion with staff in March over the 5-year forecast, and at that meeting, it was, I think, accepted that the annual cost and forecast for the CWPP would be in the range of 8.5 to 9.6 million over the next 5 years. However, I really do salute and commend you for your discussion you've had today to move off of the 3 million and onto something that I think is much more focused on your long-term leadership and commitment to implementing the full CWPP. I also want to reference, Chair Ramos, your point about suppression costs, emergency costs, contingency costs, as well as the mitigation costs for the CWPP. At the local level, with fire safe councils that we have throughout the valley now and hope to have more, there really is no difference. The two go together. Suppression costs are helped by the mitigation we do with defensible space, with creating fire roads and fuel breaks. Up in St. Helena, for example, we've completed some roadside clearance projects with the help of NCFF, with Napa Firewise. On the west side, we're also completing a updated fire road and shaded fuel break. Those all help our firefighters get up faster to a fire and stop it from continuing to spread, while at the same time they protect our neighbors in terms of defensible space and mitigation. So I think in the future, what's very important here, as you move from the 6 million hopefully to a more sustained, what I think should be 10 million a year, that you keep in mind that suppression and mitigation go together. And by the way, this year looks a lot like 2017 in terms of risk. As Chair Ramos pointed out, that was a year we had a lot of rain in the winter, and look what happened in the fall. So I really commend you to hopefully continue to push for stable, sufficient funding for the CWPP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Next speaker.
Hi, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Piper Cole. I've been a resident of Napa County since 1998. I'm also the founder and co-lead of the Calistoga Fire Safe Council, as well as vice chair of the board of Napa Firewise. So I would echo what both of the previous two speakers said. We are gratified at your understanding of the issue. We're pleased with the increase from 3 million to 6 million. More needs to be done. We need to send a message to the insurance carriers that the entire community, including our county government, are behind the suppression efforts. The prevention efforts, because it does help with the suppression. It decreases the cost of the fires itself. And so all of that is very important. But I also wanted to take a little bit of time and respond to Supervisor Gregory's question about the match on the BRIC grant. So one of the activities that Napa Firewise is doing currently is sort of a test case for what we could do under the BRIC grant. And this is our Defensible Space Cost Share Program, where we are matching funds from residents to do defensible space work. So those funds in a BRIC grant context, the funds that are spent by the resident would be part of the matching funds. So it wouldn't just come from county government. We're anticipating that these programs would be put on steroids if we do get the BRIC grant, and we would have the infrastructure set up so that the resident work that's done would be considered matching funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Piper. Next speaker, please.
Donna Morgan, 152 Bonnybrook Lane, previously of 531 View Ridge Drive in Angwin. I want to start by telling you a little story. It's a bedtime story. It happened one night in the year 2020, as I always did before I helped my husband get into bed. He was quite ill. We reviewed the chart of steps he should take to get ready to leave the bedroom, because I was in an adjoining bedroom and I of course knew what I had to do, but he couldn't remember very well. So on this very hot evening with high winds, red flag warning, I slept with my window open. I was just half asleep, and I got a phone call from a friend in St. Helena, and she said, "Get the hell off that mountain. It's on fire." So I went in, woke Jack up. He started following his chart, the things he was prepared to do. And we got on the road, and we, as we were coming around the Devil's Elbow, the flames were just to our right above the hill. And I said, let's go by and tell our friend that we're off the mountain and we're safely on our way to Napa. So we did. And later, she voluntarily evacuated St. Helena, because I hope you all know that St. Helena had fire on 3 sides that night. But at any rate, we were evacuated for at least 2 weeks. My husband was ill. The facilities where we were not adequate for his care. And so my daughter had been telling us for years, get off that mountain. And she said, there's a safe place in Napa. The safe place is Silverado. So we bought this home in Silverado, and guess what, folks? The next year, the code enforcement officer was there saying, you've got to get rid of all this flammable material. So I thought I was escaping fire, but the irony of my story is that you can run from fire in this county, but you cannot hide. And I see that the increasing temperatures, the volatility of the winds, I think we need to really be prepared for something that we have never experienced before. I want to put in a word for Firewise. We moved to Angwin in 1989. We've been there over 30 years. And that street was so, well, anyway.
I'll let you have another 20 seconds.
Okay. So I started with Firewise, and it was my service was volunteer, and this body gave me a great recognition for the work we had done. But I've been affiliated with Firewise, not directly, but at least indirectly, for many, many years. And I can verify that those people have boots on the ground, they have skin in the game, and you cannot buy that kind of volunteer work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna. Do we have any other speakers?
Hello, my name's Bill Foreman. I live at 310 Deer Hollow Drive in Silverado. I'm a 15-year resident of Napa County. I serve as president of the Silverado Property Owners Association. As such, I represent 1,091 households in Silverado, and I'm here to speak on their behalf. Like more than 140 of my friends and neighbors, my house burned to the ground in October 2017 in the Napa fire. As you well know, that fire was allowed to burn virulently because the state and the county had neglected to clear brush or flammable growth or take much of any proactive steps to prevent fire for literally half a century, which I would regard as an almost unimaginable neglect of duty. Since 2017, the turnaround in approach from the state and the county have been equally remarkable and heartening. From Firewise's well-thought-out community wildfire protection plan to the intensified CAL FIRE home hardening programs to the acquisition of firefighting aircraft and all the other steps the state and county have taken to prevent a recurrence, we're dramatically better prepared to cope with wildfire than we were just a few short years ago. But now, seemingly, the county has decided that there's no need to fully fund Firewise and its programs. Everyone has known for a long time what amount it was going to take to execute this year of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And now seemingly you're going to starve Firewise of the money that it needs to complete that program. It's the worst possible time for this. Flammable vegetation is growing profusely all over the county, just like the wet winter that preceded the 2017 fires. Insurance companies are bolting from the state en masse because, in very large part, because of the threat of uncontrolled wildfire liability. The state doesn't have the money to bail us out, and we simply need to complete the Firewise program if we're going to stay on track for safety. There's $271 million of discretionary money in the general fund, and at least $69 million that you have available. And I challenge you to find one single item in that budget which is more important than keeping the residents safe from fire.
Thank you.
That's all.
Any other public comment?
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Michelle Novi with the Napa Valley Vintners. I just first wanted to say thank you for including in the budget this year funding for a fire administrator. This is a really positive step and something that the Vintners Association has been asking for since 2020. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing the excellent work that the person hired for that role does. Second, I want to applaud you on your discussion today and the recognition that the funding level for the CWPP in this coming fiscal year needed to be at least $6 million. I think previous speakers have alluded to the full funding amount and how incredible that would be for our community, but I do want to applaud you on bringing that number up from 3 to 6. It was a really positive step and very encouraging. And like Supervisor Cottrell said, this does yield, these dollars yield multiple benefits in terms of the insurance market and how our community is perceived, in terms of our overall climate resilience, and ultimately public health for those that will be affected by the smoke particles when we do have a fire. Hopefully that it'll be a much smaller in magnitude. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on something that Supervisor Pedrosa said, that this is about collaboration and we are all in this together. The vintners have been working on fire issues since 2017, when several of our members were affected, and then 2020, when so much of our community was affected. We have had a very robust fire prevention and mitigation committee, and then just recently in November of last year raised $2.1 million for the Healthy Forest Initiative, part of which is going to fund NCFF and the CWPP. So thank you for sharing that message of collaboration, and I hope that we can all continue to collaborate together in the future to see the CWPP be fully funded. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, Molly Moran-Williams with the Napa Valley Grape Growers with a mission to cultivate viticultural excellence and environmental stewardship for the Napa Valley. It was interesting listening all day today because I can see how many really important elements there are to discuss, you know, not only fire, but when it comes to fire, NVG has been particularly involved in discussions pertaining to resiliency and preparedness. We've partnered with our industry partners, FireWise and Napa County Fire, to do several educational outreach initiatives and programs, including instituting the annual Fire Resources Fair for the community. And even as a nonprofit, we've personally invested funds to cover the costs of things like early detection. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for to the county staff recommending funding a fire administrator staff position. We believe that this person is essential moving forward to bring together the various efforts across agencies and the public and private sector. And I also do want to commend the really dynamic discussion that you had today, which showed a true understanding of the great need to continue to sustain the CWPP and come up with future funding streams. As was noted, community safety relies on it, as does the viability of homes and businesses to attain insurance policies, which unfortunately do continue to be canceled. Lastly, with reference to the parking lot, we'd love to continue, we'd love for the county to continue engaging in conversations around advances in technology that might apply towards, continuing to advance capabilities in things like early detection or mapping of high risk areas, programs like Flame Mapper or, AI detection. I think it's just great a lot of that technology is changing very quickly and emerging. And so for the parking lot, I think a review of what's out there would be really interesting in 2024. So thank you. Appreciate the discussion today.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Seeing none, I will close public comment and bring it back to the board. First, I'll go back to Ms. Craig. Any final comments?
There have been multiple items provided to the staff to bring back for future discussion. In particular, though, there was 2 items for funding, and one is to bring back a funding of the Attorney Public Defender 1, 2, 3 position that will be maintained but not funded, and that discussion will come back in a few months, and to bring a supplemental to the budget to have it effective at adoption on July 1st to provide $6 million to NCFF for its ongoing services and to fund the draw on the fire funds fund balance in order to maintain a fund balance there. I heard one recommendation to fully fund the draw on fund balance, and I didn't hear from anyone else if they wanted that amount or a different amount, or if you want us to do an assessment such as a certain percentage of reserves to have on hand in the fire fund and to make that recommendation. So any direction? Then we will fund the full draw. Yes.
My recommendation would be to fund the entire amount from the accumulated capital outlay, and to allow staff upon the closing of the fiscal year to, whether it's the closing of the fiscal year through excess ERAF or whether it is through grants that come in, whether it be BRIC or the H followed by letters.
Right.
but to really allow staff that opportunity. There is a commitment because we have already said we're moving forward. We're going to be working on a reimbursement basis. It's not like this is an allocation that's walking out the door on July 1st, and I feel we do have time to be able to do that. But to allow, my recommendation would be for this board to allow a healthy fund in the fire fund, knowing that we've got costs coming up next year. And as with every fire season, we have unknowns.
I'm happy to support that, and I started wanting to use the entire fire fund, so happy to make that pivot. I think it's the right thing to do, but I do want to see, and again, not tied to this action, but I do want to see the fire fund analysis come back. I want to know how we're using it, when we're using it, because if we're using it for fleet, my understanding as someone that's on the ad hoc that's negotiating the agreement with CAL FIRE, there's certain elements in that are tied to equipment. So I just want to make sure that we understand and we're managing the public's expectation of what that fire fund reserve is for and how it's being utilized.
Sounds good. And we will be bringing a comprehensive discussion on fire regarding the cooperative agreement, the agreements with the town and the vet's home, as well as the fire master plan at the next board meeting.
Supervisor Gregory?
I'll agree with your recommendation.
Great. Supervisor Cottrell?
Yeah, I can also support that recommendation. I do have the same concerns as Supervisor Pedrosa to really understand and make sure we have guardrails, I guess, on what that fund will be accessed for throughout the year. And then I also wanted to, I know, so we could have the financial parking lot and then maybe non-financial, but the idea of a discussion about reserve policy, I think I would also like to add into that something I think I share with a lot of what I've heard today is that this concern about, our revenues increasing by 3% and our expenses by 7%, and that is not a healthy trend. And so to be able to have a conversation about where we go with that, I could see that folding in with the reserve policy as a suggestion.
As an add-on to the reserve policy, I think a history of when we have tapped into those reserves is going to be important, I think, but also the value of those reserves for what it means for our not our credit rating, our credit rating and our bonding capability, because we get to have really cheap money because we've got great financing, great fiscal policies at the county. And so that's a valuable commodity that I think needs to be part of that discussion as well. Perhaps, Ms. Craig, if you can kind of summarize the parking lot as you understand it so that this is our opportunity to add anything.
In no particular order, because I just wrote where I had space, to return with a discussion of the reserve policy with a comprehensive analysis of the pros and cons of any actual uses and the changes that could be made. Funding of the Regional Climate Action Plan, the review of code compliance and enforcement's fees and manual in relation to when the fees are updated, highlight any potential additional EV charging stations in the garage as funding allows, to identify a durable funding for fire prevention services, and to bring back the 10-plus year CWPP that is being developed by the community for the board's review and consideration, and to then commit excess ERAF as the backfill to the accumulated capital outlay for the draw for the fire fund. And finally, in my notes, to have a further discussion of the affordable housing funding and the efforts associated there too.
Did I not hear the public defender?
That I mentioned a minute ago as an actual fiscal.
As a fiscal. Okay. So we've got it all. Anything that's missing, colleagues? Okay.
I also had the deep dive in the fire fund and the sustainability of costs and expenditures, as both been mentioned, as well as the policy on the percentage of staff costs vis-a-vis the total general fund.
Excellent. Thank you. So at this time, what I will be asking for is a motion to tentatively approve the budget as proposed with the noted fiscal and operational changes that have been summarized by Assistant CEO Craig, and within that motion to continue this hearing to June 27th.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion by Supervisor Pedroza, second by Supervisor Cottrell. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. We will continue this hearing to June 27th. And I exercise a lot of privilege and say there are no legislative items and there are no committee reports or announcements from the board. We will be, there are no future agenda items, and we do not have any CEO reports at this time. We do not have closed session, and we will adjourn to the Board of Supervisors regular meeting tomorrow, Tuesday, June 13th, 2023, for our deja vu of special districts. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.